I shouldn't have gone back to that house. Every fiber of my being screamed to stay away, but the emotional pull of a distorted memory drew me back in. Everything was silent when I arrived, but the silence of an uninhabited house, it wasn't natural. It whispered the secrets I wanted to forget. I opened the front door, and the sound echoed down the empty halls. The air was heavy, as if something was lurking, waiting. I walked down the hallway, past rooms that were once full of life. The living room, the kitchen, everything seemed frozen in time. And then I reached the end of the hallway. The door to the red room was slightly ajar. I swallowed hard. "It's not real," I whispered to myself. "They're just memories." My hands trembled as I pushed the door open. When I stepped inside, the room was empty. Nothing was out of place. The double bed, the old wardrobe, the dusty curtains. But the air felt different here, heavy, as if something was wrong. Something I couldn't see but could feel. Suddenly the phone rang in the living room, cutting through the silence. I ran to answer it, my heart racing. "Hello?" My voice shook. "What are you doing there?" It was my mother's voice. She sounded worried, and that calmed me, if only for a moment. I just wanted to see the house, relive some memories. She was silent for a moment. Then, in a tense voice, she whispered, "You know what happened there? You shouldn't have gone back." "I know, but they were my grandparents." "They weren't the people you think they were. Get out. Now." When I was a child, my grandparents' house always seemed bigger than it really was. It had that scent of old wood, mixed with the fragrance of the flowers my grandmother grew. But what I always avoided was the room at the end of the hallway, the red room. I never knew why it was called that, but it was where my nightmares took shape. It was also the room where my grandparents died. Together, holding hands, they were inseparable. At least, that's what they always said. I should have listened. I should have left. But something kept me tied to that house. An insatiable need to understand what really happened to my grandparents. The second night was worse, much worse. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. My body froze. I wasn't alone. The sound grew closer, each step echoing as if someone was slowly walking toward the room where I was. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, but the sound continued. Panic swelled inside me, and my eyes locked on the slightly open door of the red room across the hall. I knew it was there. I knew something was waiting for me. I got up slowly, my legs trembling. The footsteps stopped as I neared the door. I took a deep breath and, with a shaking hand, pushed it open. The room was different. The walls were stained with dark red, as if blood had seeped from within them. The curtains swayed gently, though there was no breeze. And in the center of the room, I saw something that froze me in terror. There, lying on the bed, were my grandparents, or at least what remained of them. Their bodies were just skeletons covered with scraps of skin, still holding hands. But the most horrifying thing was the movement. Their heads slowly turned toward me. Their empty eyes fixed on me, and a low, dragging sound escaped their mouths. "You've come to see us, at last." I tried to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The room seemed to suck all the energy from me, trapping me there. I wanted to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. You're dead," I managed to whisper, my mind unable to process the horror in front of me. My grandmother, or what was left of her, smiled with her decaying lips. "We've always been here, waiting for you to discover the truth." "The truth?" I asked, my voice filled with fear. "You never knew what really happened that night, did you?" My grandfather said in a slow, dragging voice. "It wasn't an accident. It wasn't natural death." My eyes widened. What are you saying?" My grandmother laughed, a dry, distorted sound. "We killed each other. That room, it did this to us, and now it's going to do the same to you." No, I turned to run. But the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped with the dead. Despair consumed me. My grandparents began to rise from the bed, moving erratically and slowly but relentlessly. With each step they took, the air around me grew heavier, more oppressive. My mind was on the verge of collapse. You can't keep me here," I screamed, pushing against the door with all my strength. But nothing happened. "You belong to this place," my grandfather said, his voice cold and lifeless. "You always have." I knew there was no way out. The room, the house, they were pulling me toward the same fate that claimed them. My grandparents, dead but not at peace, wanted to take me with them. Suddenly, the phone rang again. The sound echoed through the house, and with one last burst of energy, I ran to answer it. "Hello? Hello?" I shouted, desperate. "Get out. Now." It was my mother's voice again, but she sounded distant, distorted. "Before it's too late." I looked toward the hallway, toward the red room. And then, without thinking, I dropped the phone and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Now I'm here, outside of that house, but not free from it. I never will be. What happened to my grandparents will happen to me. It's only a matter of time. Because even outside, I still feel the presence of that room, as if I left a part of myself inside it. And what scares me the most is that one day I know I'll go back. It all started as a simple idea. Me, Emily, my boyfriend Jack, and some friends decided to escape the daily grind and spend the weekend at a secluded cabin in the mountains, surrounded by a dense forest. It was the typical movie scene: fresh air, complete silence, and a full moon in the sky. We weren't afraid. After all, we were adults, too busy with everyday life to believe in old legends or superstitions. Besides Jack and me, there were Connor and Alyssa, childhood friends who always had a joke for every situation. There was also Megan, a coworker of mine, quieter and more reserved, but she seemed eager for a little adventure. Everything seemed perfect, until the second night. We were gathered around the fireplace, laughing and telling stories as the wood crackled beneath the flames. The moon was high, pouring a pale light through the window. The cabin was cozy, but the wind outside seemed stronger than usual, whispering through the trees as if trying to warn us of something. "It's really windy," Megan remarked, her voice slightly shaky as she glanced at the window. "Relax, it's just the wind," Connor replied with his typical carefree smile. "Nothing's gonna bother us here." I was about to agree when I heard the first howl. It sliced through the night air like a blade, long and mournful, so intense it made my heart stop for a second. "Was that a wolf?" Jack asked, frowning. "Probably." Alyssa shrugged, but her eyes betrayed a hint of unease. "That didn't sound like a normal wolf," Megan whispered, hugging herself to fend off the sudden cold that filled the room. The howl echoed again, closer this time. A chill ran down my spine. "Maybe we should close the windows," I suggested, feeling something unsettling that I couldn't quite explain. "Yeah, just as a precaution," Jack agreed, but there was something in his voice that showed he was starting to feel uneasy too. We locked the doors and windows, trying to shake off the feeling of looming danger, but nothing felt right. On the second night, everything changed. We were all sitting in the living room, playing cards and drinking wine, trying to forget the howls from the night before. The tension in the air was palpable, like the forest itself was holding its breath. When Jack went outside to grab more firewood, the silence was shattered by a deafening noise. Something crashed against the cabin door. "What was that?" Alyssa shouted, already rising from her chair. We rushed to the door, and before we could open it, something violently slammed against it from outside. A brutal thud that shook the entire cabin. Megan screamed as Connor ran to grab a knife from the kitchen. Jack, are you out there?" I shouted, terrified. He didn't answer, but the sound of something heavy dragging across the ground outside was followed by a horrific scream. I ran to open the door, but Connor held me back. "Wait, we don't know what's out there. It's Jack," I screamed, struggling to break free. That's when we heard the footsteps, but they weren't Jack's. They were heavy, slow, followed by a deep growl. Something was circling outside, something far bigger than any wolf I'd ever imagined. "There's something out there," I whispered, barely able to believe what I was hearing. After a few minutes of suffocating silence, the window shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a creature burst through the opening. It was enormous, a grotesque mix of man and wolf, its eyes glowing yellow like fire. Its claws, sharp as blades, glimmered in the light of the fireplace. "Run!" Connor shouted, pulling Megan into the hallway while I tried to hold on to Alyssa, who was in shock. The creature looked at us with a mix of hunger and malice. Jack was nowhere to be found. The werewolf attacked with terrifying speed. Connor tried to confront it with the knife, but in a swift motion, the creature hurled him against the wall. The sound of his bones breaking was accompanied by his muffled scream. Megan screamed, running toward the door, but the monster was faster, catching her and ripping into her with its claws. Alyssa and I were paralyzed, watching the horrifying scene unfold. The smell of blood filled the air as Megan's body fell to the ground, lifeless. No. No. I whispered, trying to pull Alyssa away, but she couldn't move. Alyssa and I managed to escape to the second floor, locking the door behind us. The werewolf was downstairs, tearing and breaking everything in its path. I was trembling, trying to think of a way to escape. Emily? We're going to die, aren't we? Alyssa whispered, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't answer. The sound of claws scraping the stairs was enough to make me understand that yes, death was waiting for us. The door exploded open, and the creature entered the room. Alyssa tried to flee, but the werewolf reached her first. I screamed as I saw its claws pierce her chest, blood spraying everywhere. I threw myself to the floor, trying to crawl away, but the pain in my back and the paralysis of fear were overwhelming. I knew it was my end. But at the last moment, the monster paused. Its wild eyes met mine, and for a second I saw something human there. Then it lunged, its claws digging into my flesh. The world began to darken as I felt the blood spill out. It released me onto the floor and fled through the window, leaving me in a state of terror and confusion. I woke up to sunlight flooding the destroyed room. Everything was silent. I dragged myself to the window and saw Jack's body on the ground, mutilated. We were all dead, or nearly so. I looked at the bite marks on my arm. What would I become now? Had that thing transformed me? Would I die in agony or become a monster like it? The last survivors of our little adventure were scattered around the cabin, dead or on the verge of becoming something worse. And I, sitting there, watching the red dawn sky, awaited my end or perhaps a dark new beginning. I was alone, but not for long. I will never forget that night at the orphanage. The night everything changed. The place seemed like the perfect choice for a party, isolated, old, filled with ghost stories. The other teens were eager for something different, something they thought would make them feel alive. I, Emily Carter, was never a big fan of that kind of thing, but I was convinced. Of course, there's always that feeling of wanting to belong, of not wanting to be the weirdo who says no. The abandoned orphanage stood on the outskirts of town. Everyone said it was cursed, that strange things happened there. It was the perfect setting for something to go wrong. But at that time, we were naive. We thought nothing bad could happen to us. Life was a party, and that night, well, it was just another opportunity for us to have fun. Or at least, that's what we thought. The house was a giant stone structure, old and creaking, with doors dragging along the floor and dirty windows letting moonlight filter in through murky beams. There was a strange smell in the air, a mix of mold and something I couldn't quite identify. We entered with flashlights, loud laughter, and drinks hidden in our backpacks. There were Matt, the leader of the group, always ready with a joke, and his girlfriend, Chloe, the popular girl, full of confidence. Mark and his twin sister, Lisa, were inseparable as always, and Jason, the quiet boy, was always present. And lastly, there was Lizzie, my best friend. She was the only one who seemed as nervous as I was. The clock struck midnight when Matt suggested, what if we do something really scary? Something that will make us remember this night forever. He pulled a Ouija board out of his backpack. Lizzie recoiled, her eyes wide. That's not a good idea. We don't know what we're doing. Oh, come on, Lizzie. It's just a game, Matt laughed, placing the board on the dusty floor of the main hall. Or are you scared? And as always, no one wanted to be the chicken. We sat around the board, our flashlights casting strange shadows on the walls. The temperature in the orphanage seemed to drop a few degrees, but everyone was too focused on the board to notice. Come on, Emily, you're gonna start, Chloe said, pushing me forward. I hesitated, but gave in. I touched the planchette and asked, is anyone here? For a moment, nothing happened, and then the planchette began to move on its own, first slowly, then faster. Are you guys pushing this? I asked, trying not to show my nervousness. Everyone shook their heads, but the nervous giggles showed that, despite the fear, no one really believed. The answer was simple, yes. That's when everything changed. The planchette suddenly stopped and Matt laughed. Oh, this is getting boring. Hey, if there really is a spirit here, what can you do for us? Grant our wishes? As soon as he said that, a cold voice echoed through the hall. It wasn't a voice I could identify. It didn't come from any of us. Yes, one wish for each. Silence fell over the room. Fear was etched on everyone's faces, but Matt, as stubborn as ever, laughed. Okay, I want to be rich. A millionaire. I want money falling from the sky. The voice responded without hesitation. Done. One by one, they made their wishes. Chloe wanted to be famous, with millions of followers and fans. Jason wanted to be immortal, to live forever. Mark asked for strength. He wanted to be the strongest and unbreakable. Lisa, the most insecure of all, wished for eternal beauty. Lizzie, trying to be more modest, wished to be happy, without worrying about what others thought. And then it was my turn. I didn't know what to wish for. My friends were looking at me expecting something grand, but all I wanted was to leave, to go back to my normal life. So I said the first thing that came to my mind, I want to live normally, until I'm 80, without anything strange. The voice paused. Done. The others laughed. Seriously, Emily? Is that your wish? Chloe mocked. You could have asked for anything. I didn't care. I just wanted it to be over. The party ended shortly after. We left the orphanage, nervous and exhausted, thinking it had all been a joke. But the next morning, things began to change. Matt was the first. 2 days later, he was found dead in his home. The news reported that he had drowned in a pool of money. Literally. Authorities couldn't explain how bills and coins had filled the entire house up to the ceiling. Chloe, of course, thought it was a coincidence. But a week later, while live streaming for her followers, she collapsed. On the screen, her eyes rolled back, and she just stopped moving. The doctor said her brain had completely shut down with no explanation. She had become famous, but at the cost of her own sanity. With each passing month, one more of us died. Jason, who wanted to be immortal, was found trapped in a hellish cycle of suffering. He couldn't die, but his body was utterly disfigured, tortured by something we never managed to understand. Mark, the strongest of us, was crushed by his own car. And Lisa, well, she became the most beautiful woman anyone had ever seen, but her flesh began to rot from the inside out, as if something was eating away at her beauty. And Lizzie, my best friend, died with a smile on her face. They said it was natural, but I knew it wasn't. She was happy, just as she had wished, but inside, something was wrong. Something had taken her life. A year passed and I was the only one left. All my friends were dead, in ways no one could explain. I lived in fear, waiting for the moment when my wish would also demand its price. But days went by, and I remained alive. Until that night. It was my 81st birthday. Exactly 65 years since the party at the orphanage. I was in my room when I heard the voice again, the same cold, empty voice. You are the last. I turned, and there it was, the entity we had toyed with that night. Its black eyes watched me, devoid of emotion. You wished to live normally until 80, and you did. But now, time is up. Your wish was the cleverest of all for a naive teenager. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The entity took a step forward, extending its hand. Now you come with me. There are things you simply can't forget. Things that are etched into your memory like a scar that never fades. I, Peter, at 12 years old, am the only one left. Me and my little sister Lily. She won't remember anything, thank goodness. But I will. Every time I close my eyes, it all comes rushing back. Every time I hear the silence of the night, I remember what happened on that trip. It was supposed to be a week of rest, but it turned into a nightmare from which I've never been able to wake. The vacation started off normally. My parents, Tom and Susan, decided to take us to a secluded cabin by a crystal-clear lake, surrounded by towering trees. It was an old house with large windows and a porch that seemed to embrace the surrounding scenery. My uncles, Ben and Laura, and my cousins, Rachel and Jenna, came along. 8 of us in total. It was a big, close-knit family. We were excited to spend a week away from the city, disconnected from the world. The air was fresh, the lake was calm, it seemed perfect. Rachel, my 17-year-old cousin, was restless, always with a camera in hand. On the first day, she vanished into the woods, capturing photos of the lake, the trees, the birds. We didn't even think twice about it, it was just her way. She'll be back soon, my dad said, unconcerned. And she did return, as she always did, before night fell. But something was strange about that forest. Something I can only understand now. I didn't know it then, but we had all been watched since the moment we arrived. On the second day, Rachel left earlier than usual to explore. Morning passed, and no one noticed that she hadn't come back yet. In the afternoon, my mom started to ask about her. My dad, calm as ever, said she must be taking pictures. She'll be back soon, just like she always does. When dinner came and Rachel still hadn't returned, my mom began to panic. Hours went by, and there was no sign of her. We decided to search for her. My dad, my Uncle Ben, and I grabbed flashlights and ventured into the woods. It was a trail Rachel already knew, but each step farther seemed to lead us deeper into the unknown. The trees stood tall and still, and the silence around us was almost suffocating. "Rachel," my dad shouted, but the sound of his voice was swallowed by the darkness. We searched for hours, and then near the lake, we found her shoe. Lonely, caked with dirt, with no sign of Rachel. That night was tense. We all gathered in the living room with the doors locked and the curtains drawn. Fear hung in the air, but no one spoke aloud what we were really thinking. Rachel was no longer just lost. The third day began even quieter than the ones before. My mom couldn't stop crying, and my dad barely spoke. Everyone was trying to process what was happening. Everyone except me. Something about that house, that forest, was wrong. I could feel it. I felt it in the way the wind blew, how the trees cast shadows over us, how the lake seemed to reflect something beyond the sky. When night fell and we were trying to sleep, a sound shattered the silence. The living room window shattered. We rushed over, my dad in the lead, and found the living room window wrecked, shards of glass scattered across the floor. My dad looked outside, but there was nothing, just darkness. It was as if something was trying to get in or warn us. Fear began to take hold of everyone. My aunts whispered that something strange was happening while my dad tried to keep calm. But we all felt it. Something was near. Something that wasn't human. After another day with no sign of Rachel, we decided it was time to leave. My mom pleaded for us to go back to the city, and my dad finally relented. But before we left, he wanted to make one last search. We all set out together silently, as if sensing that this would be our last chance. And it was during that search that Jimmy, my 15-year-old brother, found Rachel's body. She lay stretched out among the trees on her back, her eyes wide, her face pale. My mom screamed, dropping to her knees beside my cousin's body. I could only stare, unable to comprehend how this had happened. There were no visible wounds, nothing to indicate what had killed Rachel. She was just dead. My dad carried her body back to the house, and that's when we realized how far we had gone. We were trapped there, with something we couldn't see, something that had already taken us once. That night, the tension was unbearable. The atmosphere in the house was one of pure fear. My dad and Uncle Ben were planning how to get out of there the next morning, but we knew that something wouldn't let us. And it didn't take long for the thing to start acting. It was late at night when we heard heavy footsteps upstairs. Footsteps that couldn't belong to any of us. The whole house seemed to tremble with that sound. My dad, armed with a kitchen knife, slowly ascended the stairs, with my uncle right behind him. My mom held my little sister Lily tightly, her eyes wide with fear. Then we heard the scream, a scream of pain and despair. We ran to the hallway, but all we saw were the bodies of my dad and uncle on the floor. They were mutilated in a way I can't even describe. Blood covered the walls, and something, a shadow, quickly disappeared out of the house. That was the moment we knew we wouldn't be leaving there alive. With only half of our family still alive, my mom desperately tried to protect Lily and me. We ran to the basement, locking the door, hoping it would be enough to keep us safe. But the footsteps continued, getting closer and closer. The sound of claws scratching the door echoed through the basement until finally, it gave way. The creature entered slowly, as if it knew it had already won. My cousins tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. Jenna was the first to be caught, followed by Jimmy. My mom held Lily tightly as the creature approached her. The last sound I heard before everything went dark was my mother's scream. And then, everything went quiet. When they finally found me 2 days later, I was in shock. Holding Lily tightly, unable to speak. They found us hiding, but somehow the creature didn't kill us. Why? I'll never know. It all began with what seemed like the best opportunity of our lives. 5 friends, all eager for our dream trip. to Romania, filled with ancient stories, fairy tale castles, and dark legends. I, Hannah, along with my friends Ava, Sophie, Lily, and Grace, could hardly believe we were finally there. Our hearts pulsed with excitement and freedom. The idea of exploring such an enigmatic and exotic country was exactly what we needed to escape the monotony of life in the United States. As soon as we arrived, we settled into a small hostel in the hills of Cluj-Napoca. The scenery around us looked straight out of a horror movie. Dense forests, fog shrouding the horizon, and a constantly overcast sky, as if the sun refused to shine fully. But this only heightened our excitement. The mystery of that ancient land called to us. On our first night, we decided to explore the city. The atmosphere was unsettling, yet there was something romantic about the cobblestone streets and the old buildings. That's when we met them. They seemed to materialize from the shadows, as if they were part of the place. 3 stunning men with a beauty that bordered on the supernatural, led by Alexander, who appeared older but still irresistibly seductive. His eyes were a deep blue, and his smile, there was something dangerously captivating about it. Beside him were Adrian and Nikolai, his brothers. It was easy to lose ourselves in their presence, and we quickly fell under their spell. "Are you tourists?" Alexander asked with a smile, stepping closer to me. His voice was smooth, wrapping around me like an invisible embrace. "Yes," I replied, nervous, unable to look away. "Well, you're in luck. Tonight we're throwing a party in an old castle not far from here. A masquerade ball. You have to come." He offered me his hand, and before I could respond, Ava, always the most impulsive, had already accepted the invitation. We laughed, exchanging excited glances, and I tried to shake off the strange feeling of unease that began to form in the pit of my stomach. I knew something was wrong, but at that moment, the promise of an unforgettable night was too tempting to refuse. When we arrived at the castle, it felt like a dreamscape, or a nightmare. Candlelight flickered in the windows, and the sound of soft music filled the air. A maid handed us black velvet masks at the entrance, and soon we mingled with the other guests, all impeccably dressed, as if they had stepped out of another era. The atmosphere was surreal, and I felt as if I was outside of reality. However, as we walked through the grand hall, the strangeness of the place began to envelop us. The laughter and chatter of the other guests sounded muffled, and the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes was unsettling. Alexander appeared at my side, guiding me away from the others toward an ancient staircase that led to the upper floor. "I want to show you something special," he whispered, gripping my hand tightly. I followed him, my heart racing, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. When we reached the top, he led me into a darker, quieter chamber where the full moon illuminated the white marble floor. "Hannah, have you ever heard the legends about vampires?" he asked, his voice smooth yet tinged with something darker. "Vampires?" I laughed, but there was a lump in my throat. "I don't believe in those things." He gave a crooked smile, briefly revealing his sharp fangs. "You should." My heart froze. I tried to pull away, but he held me firmly. Fear consumed me as I realized the legends were real. He was a vampire, and now I was trapped there, with no escape. "I could kill you right now," he said, stepping closer, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that terrified me. "But that's not what I want. You are special, Hannah. I want you to join us. I can offer you something no one else can. Immortality. Wealth beyond your imagination. And best of all, eternal love at my side." I trembled, unsure of what to say, unable to process what was happening. All I wanted was to run, but his words held me captive. "But for that," he continued, "you need to prove your loyalty. I need you to help me satisfy our hunger with your friends." My blood ran cold. "My friends?" I stammered, feeling a wave of dread wash over me. Alexander nodded, moving even closer until his lips were almost touching mine. "Yes, Hannah, you love them, right? But you also want to live. You want everything I'm offering you. And for that, they need to die." I recoiled, my heart racing. I can't do that." He looked at me with a mix of pity and contempt. "They're going to die anyway. But with your help, it can be quick. Or I could let my brothers hunt them down, one by one, making it much more painful." My mind was spinning. The idea of betraying my friends was tearing me apart, but at the same time, I was utterly fascinated by Alexander. The promise of an endless life by his side seduced me, even at the cost of everything I knew. We descended the stairs, and the ballroom was now silent. The masks had fallen, and horror was unveiled. Adrian and Nikolai were already moving through the shadows, lurking, predators stalking their prey. Sophie was the first to be attacked. She was near one of the windows, gazing at the full moon when Nikolai reached her. In a swift and brutal motion, he pulled her close, his fangs sinking into her neck. Sophie's scream was drowned out by the music, but I heard it. The sound etched itself in my mind like a nightmare I would never forget. Ava, who had always been the bravest among us, tried to fight back. She grabbed a chair and smashed it against Adrian, but he laughed, dodging effortlessly with a supernatural grace. Within seconds, he was on top of her, his teeth sinking into the flesh of her throat, blood pooling on the marble floor. Grace ran toward me, tears streaming down her face. "Hannah, what's happening? Please help us." I looked at Alexander, hoping for an answer, an alternative. But he merely smiled, waiting for me to make my choice. With a lump in my throat, I turned my back on Grace, allowing her to be dragged away by Adrian into the hallway. Her screams echoed through the castle until silence returned. Now, only Lily remained, and she knew something was wrong. "Hannah, you're with them, aren't you?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with fear and betrayal. I wanted to deny it, wanted to run, to save my last friend. But Alexander was by my side, his sweet words enchanting me. "You've already made your choice, Hannah. Finish what you started." With a heavy heart, I walked toward Lily. She recoiled, tears streaming down her face. "Don't do this," she pleaded. "We were friends." My hands trembled as I approached, feeling the pain of each step. And then, before I could hesitate, Alexander grabbed Lily from behind, sinking his fangs into her neck. She fought, but it was in vain. When it was all over, Alexander came to me. "You did well, Hannah. Now, you're ready for your new life." He pulled me close, and with a swift motion sank his teeth into my skin, transporting me into a world of darkness and power. I had become one of his hunters, an immortal predator, doomed to live forever by the side of the man who had seduced me. The promises of wealth, eternal love, and power were now within my grasp, but the price was the lives of my friends. I had become the bait, the one responsible for luring more innocent youths into our clan. And as eternity stretched before me, the weight of my choices and the blood of my friends would never leave me. I was immortal, but my soul was lost forever.